Okay, so I think we start our panel, and I just want to introduce our first speakers, panelists, Rael Cahn and Antonino Raffone. Antonino Raffone, Associate Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Sapienza University of Rome. He completed his Master and PhD in Cognitive Psychology at Sapienza University. And currently he's Associate Professor at the Department of Psychology there and visiting professor and advisory faculty at Nalanda University in India. And Antonino also Director of Inter-University Center ECONA at Sapienza University of Rome and President of Consciousness, Mindfulness and Compassion International Association and Chief Editor of Specialty Section on Consciousness Research of Frontiers in Psychology. And our second panelist, Rael Cahn, who is Assistant Professor at University of South California. Rael is psychiatrist and neuroscientist at the Department of Psychiatry. And Rael works clinically in the Psychiatric Emergency Room at the LA County-USC Hospital and does research on mindfulness and other meditative practices in association with the USC Brain and Creativity Institute. He has researched the neurophysiological changes related to engaging in meditation and mindfulness practices for the past 20 years, with a primary focus on EEG and ERP outcomes. And currently, Rael is working on studies assessing the neural correlates to narrative-free awareness and the neural mechanisms underlying the efficacy of mindfulness practices for mood disorders and addiction. And Rael, honestly, I'm still using your review paper on EEG and ERP correlates of meditation as my reference guide. Whenever I'm doing research, I'm looking there as a reference for different EEG and ERP correlates. So it was very helpful. And so we'll start today talking about scientific markers of meditation. So yesterday we had a very interesting debate about, from anthropology and religious perspective, about how to define meditation and whether scientific markers are good enough to define meditation. So today we'll move to discussing scientific markers of meditation and limitation of these scientific markers and our current classification, current scientific markers of meditation, and how perhaps we need to expand these markers, or maybe we just need to change them completely and start with different markers. So what's the situation currently in research on meditation, and what are markers characterizing all meditations, and what to do if we include Vajrayana? So whether we need to revise these markers or we still can use these markers. So, and actually also I actually planned for two separate sessions, the second session more on Vajrayana and first more on meditation in general. I realized that actually those are very similar topics, and it would be really nice if Antonino and Rael, you can just stay for the second session and we will continue our discussion because it would be the same questions to everyone. Okay, so I think it would be helpful if you can start with a brief summary of your talk, and then we'll start to take questions from there. So Antonina, we start in just a few minutes, just summary, and then Rael. Yes, so
Thank you, Maria. So thanks everyone for joining this meeting. I think it's a unique opportunity to discuss these topics. Thanks to Maria for this really, I will say, visionary attempt to bridge really these different traditions. So the highlights basically that I made stem from the convergence between Buddhist psychology, some models which I can see that they converge a lot with some great insights from neuroscience of consciousness, mental states, And actually, in particular, some studies in which I've been involved, fortunately, with the outstanding participation of Theravada Buddhist monks from the Thai forest tradition of Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Sumedho, and we had the possibility to conduct investigations by fMRI, MEG, and the EEG. More recently, also about the pain aspect. And I think what an important highlight is really to see how this long-term training can really lead to some really, I would say, profound changes in brain activity. We have just done functional studies, not structural studies. For example, we were impressed to see that samatha meditation, this meditation just on the breath, but calming the mind, we have seen huge deactivations in the brain activity, so many areas. And also we have seen changes in the coupling of major brain networks like default mode network among the others. And more recent data analysis on EEG have shown the prominence of alpha band, alpha coherence, and especially in an anteriorization of alpha, that is seems to be a prominent marker. And although, of course, we don't know yet the functional meaning of this, why this alpha and alpha coherence and anterior alpha coherence is related, it's so prominent in the meditation. So these are some of the insights that we have had, especially in terms of this reorganization of the functional brain networks of the brain. Thank you.
And Rael?
Yeah. So nice to be with you all today. And just to give a brief summary of what I spoke about a little bit in my presentation, about the neurophysiology of self-related processes. To what extent can we even talk about the neurophysiology of self? It's quite difficult. But then also some specific findings related to self-experience, altered self-experience associated with meditation, and the neural findings associated with kind of searching in on that, which I'd say the field as a whole is just beginning to attempt. And in particular, some of the things I highlighted there, one is just to kind of motivate why talk about that when talking about meditation. I think there's some good reasons which really come to the purpose for which these practices were developed and have been taught now for so many hundreds of years, which really has to do with gaining experiential insight into a teaching, a philosophical position that the self, as we experience it, is an illusion. That actually one of the markers of existence is the absence of the self that we normally experience as so real and fundamentally important. So given that it's a central reason both for which people engage in practice and for which the practices teach, for which the traditions teach that these practices are beneficial, you know, I think there's some real obvious compelling reason to focus our attention as scientists on this kind of aspect of the phenomenon of meditation and the brain. And I think one of the primary reasons why it's been not investigated with a lot of attention to date has been just the combination of like this kind of fuzzy, hard to define thing of meditation, although that has become much more easy to speak about in scientific terms and psychological terms, I'd say, over the last 20 years. And then combining it with this difficult kind of fuzzy concepts with so many different philosophical and kind of experiential levels and definitions of the self, that combining these two things together, like, well, then you really end up just in a tangle. So let's, as neuroscientists, psychologists, kind of just focus on one or the other. I do think that the field is now becoming kind of mature enough that we can start to bring these concepts together in relationship with each other in meaningful ways. Then, I spoke a little bit about the narrative self as being that aspect of the self that we can most easily kind of grasp onto. When thinking about the levels of self, I think it's useful, and there's some universals to a kind of distinction, that there's the sense of self that's related to thinking or abstract kind of word-related processing, and that this kind of self that is kind of like the me aspect of self, that we think of these qualities, they're me, that this can be pointed to with the term narrative self. But beyond underneath, kind of more fundamental levels than the narrative self is the kind of minimal self that has to do with perspective, that there's an observing perspective that's having an experience of the observed. And that minimal self doesn't require narrative processes to be present. And then there's, underneath that, and I'm just saying these three levels because I think you can, without too much kind of philosophical difficulty, a wide variety of people can accept that these three levels point to something valid about speaking about this topic. That underneath that, there's the actual experiential reality that sometimes, one even loses the contact with the sense that there's an observer and an observed, and there's just experience happening, and that's kind of phenomenologically real. And so that we could speak of something like a selfless state. And, there are many different ways of talking about it. A non-dual state of attention or awareness is another way that it's being spoken of. And there are some, practices within the Vajrayana tradition that are really aimed at helping to engender that kind of state. But just by kind of pointing at these different levels, it brings up the possibility that, well, if people have some facility through meditative practice, or maybe even non-meditators, maybe there's ways to help people kind of access these different modes of self-experience, then we can look, and are there associated brain changes with these different self-experiences? And so, of course, within each level, there are many varieties, right? There's a narrative self that can be, very loud and kind of proclaiming itself as, very real and attached to the content, versus a narrative self that is kind of observing the narrative processes without so much kind of identification. But yet there's still a sense, that's what I am, So I went through a few studies, and really there's only a few to summarize, to look at the brain changes associated with changes in self-experience. And before doing that, though, I think, I brought up the same thing that almost anybody speaking about meditation and the brain we'll speak about a little bit now, which is that there is this network of brain areas that's referred to as the default mode oftentimes, or the default network, or sometimes the intrinsic network. But it's a set of brain areas along the cortical midline and the temporoparietal junction, inferior parietal lobe, and the temporal lobes. These areas seem to fire with each other in connection with the capacity for and internal content of abstract thinking, and so they are, and each of these areas is also kind of at the top of a hierarchy of kind of networks in terms of being farthest away from primary sensory cortical areas, kind of association areas, and so this set of brain areas is certainly quite important for many aspects of the kind of unique capacities of human cognition. for our kind of capacity for self-reflection and abstract thinking, and probably, you know, anything that's highly abstract, mathematics, etc. But it also turns out that this network, this set of brain areas, is really specifically targeted and affected through meditative practices. And it makes conceptual sense once one also identifies that the default mode network becomes much more active in association with kind of rumination or any kind of real engagement with thinking, as opposed to engagement with the sensory world. And since when we meditate, we learn how to deal with and kind of modulate our thinking process so that it becomes a little less kind of automatic and uncontrolled, it makes sense. There's some effect, so many studies that have looked at default mode network under the effects, either as a trait or state effect of meditation, have found something there. And it turns out that, you know, those people who've been looking at what distinguishes the brain activity during self-related processing and non-self-related processing in just everyday any human being, regardless of meditator status, that the default mode network areas seem to fall out, you know, depending on the way that one designs the experiment, different kind of nodes within them, more often than not, when looking at two different narrative conditions, one involving more self-relatedness and one less, it's more often than not the medial prefrontal areas in particular. So there's this interesting confluence then we have of, you know, self-related processes seem to depend on this network, the default mode network, and this default mode network is really a target of meditative experience and practice. And so some of the studies that have been done by a group in Israel, I kind of summarized their work because they're the first group that I think is kind of systematically going at the neurophenomenology of self-change in relationship to meditation. And what they find, and this is Aviva Berkovich-Ohana's group, and they found across a few studies a specific relationship between a reduction in beta power in the temporoparietal areas as associated with the transition from a narrative self-experience to a kind of minimal self-experience of dying down of the narrative content to the experience of the dissolution of the observer-observed distinction, a kind of non-dual state of awareness. So I think it's interesting, and I don't have a strong interpretation of that yet. I'm curious the degree to which that turns out to be a replicable finding. And then I went into just speaking about some recent work that my colleague Arno Delorme and I have done. Arno is going to be joining in a bit, and I think he's speaking also. I saw he's speaking also on some of the findings we've uncovered from this pretty large data set we've got from a lab that we set up in India, and in Rishikesh, India, at an ashram that is teaching the tradition of what they call the Himalayan yoga tradition. We were invited by the Swami Rama Sadakagrama, a fellow by the name of Swami Veda, who was a disciple of Swami Rama of the Himalayas, to set up this lab and to do work not just on the tradition that is taught there, but on meditation traditions in general. And this particular study that we set up, we included a number of components, one of which was really focused on self-related processing. And so I think it's a sensitive and important topic to probe phenomenologically people's self-experience. And I think only by doing that will we really gain deeper insight into the brain state associated with various self-experience kind of transitions. But what this study aimed to do is to probe the evoked kind of narrative self as evoked by this interesting paradigm called the self-name paradigm that has shown to be a pretty robust way of assessing the brain's automatic attentional affiliation with the self-name. So it turns out both during wake states as well as during sleep states, light sleep, even more than deep sleep, but even in deep sleep, there's this enhanced activity in the kind of P300 late 500 to 1000 millisecond time range post stimulus presentation associated with hearing the self name compared to other names, whether that's done in a purely passive way or using the names as a kind of distractor in a task. Kind of across the board, numerous investigators have found, and of course in the sleep state, this is found using the presentations passively while people are staying asleep. And what we found is that similar to our hypothesis, the long-term meditators across three very different traditions of practice did not show the enhanced amplitude in the P300 time range to the self name compared to another name. And so it wasn't just a generic decrease of cognitive processing of all distracting stimuli. The other name stimuli were, equally likely to be heard as the self name stimuli, but specifically the self name stimuli showed this dramatic reduction in amplitude, such that there was no difference in amplitude across any of the three meditation groups between the self and the other name. And in the non-meditator group, this finding that has been published by a number of investigators over many years, that there is a difference, was replicated. So the last thing that I kind of reported on there is just that the degree of the P300, you could call it something like a P3A in terms of its being associated with automatic attentional engagement as opposed to a target-like kind of process, because the participants were asked to stay meditating and ignore the stimuli, or to stay in their thinking state and ignore the stimuli. So that P300 amplitude was actually correlated with some interesting psychometrics. And for one, it was correlated in a positive way. So the larger the self-related P3 amplitude, the more likely people were to report negative affect. Negative affect in general on the kind of average PANAS score, as well as specifically sadness and interestingly, negative affect as reported on the IRI, the interpersonal reactivity index, and a measure of some of the negative aspects of empathy, where you can kind of get overwhelmed by hearing about other people's difficult, or seeing other people's difficult experience. And then in addition, there was an inverse correlation. The greater the self-name amplitude, the lower the mindfulness scores. So that's, I hope that wasn't too much time, but I just wanted to kind of give the synopsis of my whole thing.
Thank you. And I have a question to both of you, because both your talks emphasize these aspects which are common to all meditations. One is decrease in self-referential processing, and also decrease in mind wandering. And Arnaud also talking in his talk about decrease in mind wandering. And so both kind of default mode network underlie decrease in both mind wandering and self-referential processing. And then Antonino also mentioned silency, and at least for focused attention meditation, there was deactivation in many areas in the brain. So in light of these findings, how do you think we can actually explain Vajrayana, how we can include Vajrayana meditations? Vajrayana meditation have involve a lot of visualization, so probably silence might not work. And overall, how we can look at focused attention versus open monitoring classification, which is currently the main classification in the literature. Do we need to revise it, whether, this Vajrayana style meditation will fall into this focused attention versus open monitoring? And for example, about self-referential processing, whether these non-dual types of Vajrayana meditation will show the same neural correlates of self-referential processing decrease as, let's say, open monitoring, like Zen or Vipassana types of meditation. Or here we also, so in bottom line, can we put them into these two categories, or we need to expand our classification somehow, expand our markers, neural markers? So what do you think about it?
Maybe, I don't know if I can comment, then Rael can definitely say much more than me. In this respect, the study, there are some classifications that include also NDA, non-dual awareness, no, as a form of meditation. So probably this category would probably be closely related to some Vajrayana practices. For example, there is a study by Josipovich that had some good impact on the literature showing that with non-dual awareness, there is a kind of going beyond this duality of intrinsic and extrinsic, also applied to the intrinsic network, thus the default mode network, and the extrinsic dorsal attention network, in some sense, that usually these are anti-correlated in the brain. When the extrinsic attention network goes up, the intrinsic goes down, and vice versa. But through these non-dual awareness practices, it seems in non-dual awareness meditation, in expert meditators, this it was possible to keep simultaneously activated the intrinsic and the extrinsic, in some ways as related to this non-dual awareness. And this is something that came to my mind, just to highlight this NDA category, non-dual awareness, which is in some, Josipovich is in particular involved in this. And then it's very intriguing, the visualization part of the practices, which are so intensive. So I would say that as far as I know, probably this would be bringing new data from such outstanding meditators, no? Who really give great insights about visualization. So probably Rael has also found some interesting gamma in a study in Vipassana occipital, no, in the more posterior area, for example. So what I would imagine is just hypothetical, that when you have such intense capacity of concentration, because you need that kind of concentration, probably there are effects of top-down probably effects from prefrontal cortex to the more occipital areas of visual areas, which are used also in imagery. So perhaps that could bring some coherent oscillations like gamma, for example, or beta. Usually there are some studies showing beta oscillations that are involved when there is top-down attention that drives, for example, activity in more posterior areas. So, but also perhaps there can be some studies of causality, where you can see the effects of some brain areas on other brain areas. For example, I would speculate some possibly effects from more anterior areas of the brain or more posterior areas. Just some hypothetical things that come to my mind.
Yeah, a couple of things I would say about this. Number one, I think that Cliff Sarin and Antoine Lutz, Amishi Jha, and John Dunn, that their paper from 2015, where they propose a neurophenomenological matrix as a way of orienting to meditative or contemplative practices, is a it's a step forward in the direction that we probably need to go. And this kind of focused attention, open monitoring dichotomy certainly doesn't capture the full range. In their orientation, kind of reorientation of the, it's really kind of a phenomenologic space that they proposed, and then, you know, transpose on it the kind of literature to that date that kind of would support the possible brain mechanisms that may underlie the shifts in each of the three primary dimensions that they're proposing, as well as some of the kind of qualities. And the three that they propose are meta-awareness, object orientation, and de-reification. So one of the advantages, I think, to kind of starting to think in this manner is that it helps to kind of provide some relaxation of tension that I think anybody who's engaged in these practices deeply and thought about the focused attention, open monitoring practices as kind of two sides of a spectrum has probably faced. You know, and I think, Antonino, you referenced it in your presentation, where you mentioned, you know, that these are the two practices, but there's a little bit of this in that, and a little bit of that in this. And, you know, I think what it comes down to, you know, the open monitoring, you can think of that form of practice as really a practice aimed specifically at meta-awareness, but there's this concomitant de-reification that's taking place, you know. And similarly, when you engage in a focused attention type of practice, you are becoming much more object-oriented. Object, and what they refer to in object orientation is simply, is there a focus of attention or not? And so if you're doing a focus on the breath or the body, there's an object orientation, but, you know, there's, in retraining the mind moment to moment on a specific object and not just letting it go where it goes, and oftentimes that's some self-involved kind of narrative, you gain meta-awareness about your narrative, right? And so you're training your meta-awareness capacities when you focus attention, and there's no longer this kind of like, oh, but, you know, you're either doing one or the other distinction. By introducing these three separate axes, I think you start to see how, okay, one doesn't isn't on one side of a line or another. One is somewhere in this space. And in both cases, there's the concomitant tendency, which of course is greater in an open monitoring type of practice towards de-reification, that kind of de-identification with the thinking process as somehow, you know, having inherent reality, or you know, there's that sense, kind of naive realism that, you know, people can come into practice with before really questioning their and of course philosophical kind of teachings. Existentialism as a Western philosophical enterprise, of course, is you know, very much oriented towards the de-reification kind of teaching at an intellectual level. But there's the experiential de-reification that is, you know, targeted through these types of practices. And then on top of, you know, those three domains, there's something about the aperture and the clarity, the stability and the effort that they propose. And I think those are all just really important kind of qualities of mind that more fully do capture the kind of state space that these different practices are related to, and you know, describe the way one transitions in one's experience more fully, and without such a kind of conundrum that this kind of polar conception that it's either focused attention or open monitoring. So I think that's one part of the answer. I think the other thing I would say about Vajrayana is, you know, so these are practices. Also, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, Maria, but they're sometimes referred to as tantric practices, right?
Right.
And one of the distinctions about the Vajrayana, it seems to me, is that yes, it seems that they were developed into a system within Buddhism a little bit more recently than the Hinayana or Mahayana, and that they also have this kind of interesting and, you know, for some people problematic overlap with developing of special powers. And, you know, that's why some some kind of more traditional, older style Buddhist practitioners kind of think, oh, well, that's dangerous. You shouldn't mess around with that stuff too much. But I think, the reality of how things are going to develop within humanity is that we are going to probe into what powers the mind and consciousness has and what it doesn't, regardless of whatever any spiritual tradition has to say about the matter. And so in that sense, I think the Vajrayana practice are a very interesting topic for science to tackle. And I do, as a human who's going through my own process of kind of a spiritual exploration, etc., I do have a respect for the teachings that, kind of focusing on attaining a specific kind of altered states that are very pleasurable and powerful, can be problematic. They can take one away from the important, most fundamental work for a lot of people, which is just becoming less identified with the kind of separate striving self that's kind of striving for its position in the world, and kind of obtaining some inner peace by kind of going after special experiences. It's kind of like with drugs. There's that real risk that you end up in a kind of a rat race with yourself to kind of run away from just being with things as they are. But the reality, of course, the wisdom aspects of Vajrayana practice is don't ignore that, right? And instead just propose that there are these practices that really have kind of more powerful, transformative kind of experiences of light and energy than are often pointed to within the other kind of traditional Buddhist practices. And I think that a lot of those practices, so Gautamo practice is, and a perfect example of, something that I think Western science actually, before Herbert Benson and his crew kind of went over and did those studies with, watching that these monks really were heating these blankets up off of their freezing backs, it was just kind of like, oh, that can't even be true. But yes, it clearly is true that the human body, which is connected to its kind of capacity for these interesting brain-mind states, is able to do things that we still don't have a good understanding about. And I'd say that there is something in regards to that type of practice that is not caught really very well on the simple continuum of focused attention versus open monitoring. But is captured by, and this is where I think a more phenomenological investigation of talking to people who are able to really engage in these practices is going to be important. But something about stability and clarity are probably pretty distinct with these kinds of practices. The capacity to get into that state involves both some degree of becoming very focused on an object, probably. There's some object that they are tuning into in the process of gaining this access of kind of body control, autonomic control that is so radically different than our normal capacities. And yes, you have to become somewhat meta-aware of, your thinking process. Otherwise, your thinking process won't let you tune into such a, distinct and deep kind of concentrated state. So, those are just a few thoughts. I think the last thing about the non-dual awareness, I think that's really an interesting area towards which even the mindfulness kind of research is going to start trending. And there's, within the Buddhist scholarship, I think there's been some acknowledgement that these kind of Western secularized forms of teaching mindfulness are really kind of connected to a kind of Advaita type orientation to Vipassana. So there within Jon Kabat-Zinn's way of teaching, this kind of resting in awareness practice that he does teach as part of the MBSR intervention, and that various MBSR teachers will teach or not teach depending on their own level of capacity. But that distinction that that ultimately where one is building towards in kind of learning this form of secular mindfulness, where you're not taking on the Buddhist precepts at all, is this capacity to just rest in awareness with a kind of non-attachment to not just the contents, but even the distinction that you're having an experience, just experience happening. That is the kind of teaching that he eventually leads to over the course of MBSR. And so in connection to that, I think it's just worth saying, Zoran's study, Zoran Josipovic's study that Antonino referenced, was indeed the first reference in the literature to non-dual awareness as, kind of indexed by some brain measure. And I think he found a very interesting, finding. Back in 2013, people were not yet looking at the correlation, anti-correlation of these networks with each other nearly as much. And now, much more so, even in kind of mainstream biological psychiatry, cognitive neuroscience, fMRI work, this kind of question about how these networks are speaking to each other has become really of great relevance and importance. And so, although he's the first and only person to distinctly report upon the non-dual awareness state being distinctly different from the focused attention state in these Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, based upon the anti-correlation between the extrinsic and intrinsic networks. What others have now started to report on, both Richie Davidson's group and David Cresswell's group, is that even in trying to get at, well, what brain change may go on that can be observable with fMRI over the course of just a couple of months of MBSR training, one of the things that they've been showing is some increased frontal parietal network, or central executive network, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex kind of increasing its connectivity with the default mode network, and then the PCC in particular. And so, while that is a kind of isolated finding that they're not presenting the data in the same way that Zoran presented, I think it gets at something similar, which is that these networks are becoming more in communication with each other and not so anti-correlated, even in people who are not gaining anything like a distinct capacity to maintain a non-dual awareness state while in the scanner, but just in the process of kind of tuning their network capacities for in relationship to the experience of the narrative that we have. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is just that Antonino's reference of Kalina Christoph's work in non-meditators, just showing this really pretty strong finding, it seems, that when one is having meta-awareness of the narrative process, the default mode network is not nearly as robustly active as when one is not having a meta-awareness of the narrative process. So that the default mode network is not just encoding whether one's narrative is active or not, but it's actually partly encoding the degree to which one is aware of the narrative process and lost in or not lost in. And it is important, I think, to acknowledge that probably one of the areas that I have the biggest questioning of, the kind of generalized utility of these types of practices for everyday people has to do with, some of the wonders of the default mode network. It's kind of capacity to support creative kind of inspiration and storytelling, and kind of getting lost in a story, which you have to do as a creator to create a good story. You don't want to kind of be watching yourself create the story the whole time. I would say most creators would say that about their creative process, that, the question of do these practices maybe get in the way of some aspects of that, I think is really an essential one for the field to move forward, that I don't think people are talking about in an explicit way in the literature today, but probably does deserve some attention, and certainly, you know, there are people in the world who are not engaging with the practices because they're afraid that it's going to kind of inhibit their creativity or something about their kind of the strength of their kind of affiliation with their kind of engagement with the inner world. They don't want to become more kind of observing of it. They just want to really utilize their capacity for these creative connections that the default mode network seems to kind of help support.
Okay, thank you, Rael. I just want to mention, not just from Vajrayana perspective, and we have anthropologists here, and again, correct me please if I'm wrong, but about your comment that Vajrayana is a kind of limited, not limited, but they aim at developing some kind of power. Actually, their final goal is non-dual awareness meditation. So non-dual awareness meditation, those are originally Vajrayana style meditation. And they're not supposed to be done, especially in Vajrayana tradition, from a restful state. I mean, they were supposed to be done in a state quite powerful, because according to this tradition, you do not have enough power or energy to actually get into this non-dual state without subject and object boundaries. So that was considered to be a necessary part to actually be able to get to this non-dual awareness state. So in this sense, Zoran Yusupovich study and other studies, they in some sense reduce non-dual awareness to mindfulness, because they usually perform in a very restful state. Anyway, what I'm trying to say, there is like a debate, even in Vajrayana, whether someone can perform in a restful state, similar to mindfulness, non-dual awareness states of meditation. But this is 1,000-year debate, and there is still no consensus whether one can reach non-dual state of awareness if it is performed in a restful state. So, so if we want, actually, if we to include non-dual awareness meditation into meditative literature, into scientific literature, we need to accept that those are Vajrayana style of meditation, and usually they perform not from rest, not from mindfulness kind of restful state. They perform in a very powerful energetic state. Otherwise, according to them, you will not be able to dissolve your own self. So we need to accept this, and if we accept it, then from my perspective, we might be in some kind of conflict here, because then open monitoring or focused attention might not be enough to incorporate this non-dual awareness state of meditation into one category, or incorporate this non-dual awareness state meditation into open monitoring. So I'm actually saying, because it was my problem when I started to research this meditation, whether it's really easy just to add non-dual ND meditation into open monitoring or focused attention, or we need to come from a bit a different perspective, because even focused attention meditation, because all this visualization meditation to get to this powerful state, they cannot be described by simple focused attention meditation. If you look at the study which Antonino presented, there are all these deactivation in prefrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It doesn't look like shamata's focused attention. It looks like shamata's more vigilance, alerting type of meditation. So I would say sustained attention meditation. While if you look somebody doing deity, I'm sure you will see a lot of prefrontal cortex, you will see dorsolateral cortex, it's visual, it's visualization. You would see very different activation. And of course, all visual cortex would be activated clearly. So, so even in this sense, one is more focused attention, another more sustained attention. So the situation seems to be a bit more complex. And actually, it seems to be very complex. And this is why I'm kind of raising this question, what do you think about it? I mean, in general.
Very, very interesting. Usually in the Theravada tradition, the focused attention meditation is more samatha, no? Or shamatha. Yes. It's really the idea that you get in this, it's a kind of mental state of a quiet abiding, in a sense. No, this is why. So it seems that the Vajrayana state is more intensified in terms, no, of probably more energized, as you say, no, in some sense. And so I would say that perhaps there are some commonalities in respect that you still, to support the visualization, you need to have some stability, no, of your mental stability or no attentional stability. So probably the energetic level will be different in that case, no, because one goes more in this state of deep calmness, if you like, no, of, and the other goes perhaps more in this more energized, no, kind of state. But perhaps the stability, the element of stability, no, of the practice is probably common.
The same as probably decrease in self-referential processing, right? Because they all target decrease in self-referential processing and selfness probably also will be common.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's worth just mentioning, you know, this other aspect of kind of the neuroscience of altered states of consciousness that has been evolving, you know, quite significantly over these last 20 years is the investigations of psychedelic induced states. And you know, that it's very easy for those who are familiar with those kinds of states to kind of, when they hear about this non-dual awareness experience, to say, oh yeah, that's part of what, you know, the psychedelic state is when you are, you know, having a positive experience with it. It can be such a wide variety of things. But the reason I mention it in this context is simply that that's a very activated brain state in general. I mean, it's not a quieting of the circuitry of the brain. And you know, we see these interesting overlaps with regards to some of the experiential content that, of course, tends to be more intensified with psychedelics than it is through meditation for folks who are not very experienced, or even for those who are very experienced many times. But the excitation, the relatively excited cortical state that accompanies that psychedelic experience does seem to help lead to that non-dual awareness. You know, the narrative process, one develops a kind of meta awareness about that, because it's like it becomes a caricature of itself, and one's kind of observing awareness kind of is noticing more and more, like, I've been identifying with this kind of narrative process all my life, and now I just see it's like kind of a joke. And so there's that kind of a de-reification of the kind of day-to-day affiliation with the identified narrative. And the you know, the state kind of evolves into this experience where one stops having the sense that there's an external and an internal. It's all happening within. And so, you know, that just, it's a kind of a little anecdotal kind of related kind of piece of evidence that helps support maybe this teaching within the Vajrayana practice, that kind of getting into a more excited state can actually be supportive of accessing non-dual awareness. I think that, you know, even though that may be the traditional kind of teaching of how to access these states, that that at least conceptually, you know, it seems very possible to understand that it could happen that while it's easier maybe to access a non-dual awareness state through very activating processes, energized processes, that one can also experience them in a less energized process. And correct me if I'm wrong, would you say that in the Vajrayana tradition, once one becomes more adept, then the understanding is that non-dual awareness state can, you know, easily be accessed regardless of the level of excitation or energy that a long-term practitioner might experience it even throughout the day-night cycle, throughout, for example, dreamless sleep, that kind of awareness stays present in a kind of, so I'm just curious because I don't know the teachings as well as you do.
I think we should ask, we'll have Gyaltsen Rinpoche who teaches the students this very high level Mahamudra, and we should ask him this question, because from my interview with him and as well as Wanchok Rinpoche, they're saying that actually there are no such masters that can be, I mean, maybe, but that's extremely rare, that one could be in this state. So, and usually even the most adept practitioners, the most adept can get into non-dual awareness state only after doing these energizing meditative practices. And even more than that, it's not enough to do deity self-visualization. You can get only a glimpse of this non-dual self, non-dual awareness, because deity doesn't give you enough energetic component. So you probably need to go through Tumo, which gives you way more energy. And with that energy, you can access a state of non-dual awareness. So like they don't even teach, he said, Mahamudra, non-dual awareness meditation, up to 7-8 years of retreats, because first they need to master Tumo and actually get to this level of energy, after which they can practice Mahamudra. So, and then it's going one session. So it's not that you're in a non-dual state all the time. It's going one session, they practice deity, Tumo, and then dissolution, they go into non-dual state in this sequence. Now, as you mentioned, of course, if a person extremely accomplished, but how many such people we have? Wanchok Rinpoche said, maybe yogis from 1,000 years ago, extremely accomplished, maybe they can do from restful state non-dual awareness meditation because they're so high in energy, they can get there. But for a normal person, it takes many, many years of practice to learn how to raise the energy component before they can even be taught what is this non-dual awareness meditation. But I think it's extremely interesting question for me as neuroscientist, and we should ask them more today, because how really this teaching is built on, because right now what we know in neuroscience, again, Zoran Yusupovich study, they're extremely unique and they show very interesting intrinsic, extrinsic network results. But here, Mahamudra is done straight from the rest. And as I mentioned, this is not how Mahamudra practice in Tibetan tradition. Now, again, there is a Sutra Mahamudra, which is kind of not Tantra Mahamudra, and you still can get to some sort of non-dual state. But even in Tibetan Buddhism, there is a huge 1,000-year debate whether this is the same state of mind, non-dual awareness, the same level as Tantra Mahamudra, where you build first on high energy level, and then you go into this non-dual awareness state.
Yeah, I think it's probably an important thing to mention in that regard, that within the West, the interest in non-dual states is becoming more and more explicit, right? There's this fairly widely attended and kind of engaging conference called the Science and Non-Duality Conference every year. I haven't been yet myself, but I see that they're attracting quite a number of both scholars as well as practitioners and teachers, and just kind of knowing some of the folks in the contemplative neuroscience world that kind of like myself, a lot of them, including, I'll just bring up Richie Davidson's name, he's kind of getting interested more and more in these kind of non-dual type practices as he's gone, on his own personal trajectory with regards to meditation. And that there is a variety of kind of teachings around non-dual practice, and Mahamudra and Dzogchen are probably two of the most commonly referred to kind of techniques within Buddhism. But then even within non-Buddhist traditions, now that there's this distinction about, well, what do you mean when you talk about non-dual? Oh, well, that distinction between the duality of self and non-self, or observer and observed, kind of is broken. There's no longer that sense of reality to a distinction there. that is a kind of state, that the varieties along that spectrum can be kind of identified even in non-meditation kind of contexts, like kind of becoming deeply absorbed in music, or kind of flow states and these kind of things. And I think it's important to not kind of say that just because this kind of sounds similar to a lot of people that they are similar things, but I just mean to point to as this distinction about it's possible to experience something like a non-dual state is becoming more and more kind of I would say spoken about within the both on the spiritual side of folks in the West who are kind of interested in exploring these kinds of practices, as well as on the side of the beginnings of the kind of contemplative science community starting to grapple with, well, this seems important and how do we talk about it? That there's more than one kind of teaching about it that is to be referenced.
And we have one question. Actually, it would be you are staying, right, guys, for the next session, Rael
Sure.
and Antonino, right? We will continue our session after the break, but we have one more question, one more comment from Michael Sheehy. Michael, please.
Hi, thanks so much. I just want to sort of jump in here with some commentary from the Tibetan tradition and how they conceptualize meditation, a little bit in conversation about ideas of non-duality. So a distinction is made between meditative states, what we call nyamjak, meditative equipoise, during a session while you're actually practicing. And those can be radically unmediated. And all sorts of experiences, including that of non-thought or non-conceptualization, can arise. And they can be sustained, claimed by the tradition for extended periods. And we can talk about that, because that extension or sustaining of the sort of radically unmediated experience is what meditation is very much, the practices of meditation and the varieties are very much sort of geared towards. But that's distinct from post-meditative states, right? What are called jetop. And jetop are mediated states. They're highly mediated. They're socially mediated. They're mediated by the constructed world, having to do with all sorts of relationships with how we conceive phenomena, pens, persons, our orientation in space, our given who we are, body schema, language, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is deeply informed and informs the kind of post-meditative experience. And the segues between these two, meditative absorption or equipoise, nyamjak, and post-meditative mediated experiences, jetok, they talk about as being quite distinctive. So if we're going to talk about non-duality, we have to talk about conceptualization or non-conceptualization. Non-duality, as far as the sort of implosion of the subject-object complex, whether that's contingent on conceptuality, is also a conversation we need to have either within or about the meditative state or post-meditative. The Tibetan traditions don't say in the post-meditative state, that is to say, when a Buddha, even what they call complete Buddha, unexcelled enlightened being or awakened being, comes out of the meditative state, that's also highly mediated. There's all sorts of concepts. They understand what a pen is, and they understand how to speak languages, and they understand which way is north and which way is south, and so on and so forth. So conceptuality, as far as thinking about it as a divider in the sense of dual or non-dual, is also something that they talk about given sort of meditative or post-meditative experiences. And I just want to bring that into the conversation because there's a lot of talk on that in the Tibetan tradition, or what we call the Vajrayana tradition, Himalayan more broadly. having to do with what is a concept to begin with, because concepts are understood to be, or conceptuality are understood to be the sort of forces that of contingency between those two, right? What we'll call dual or non-dual, or meditative or post-meditative. So what are concepts? And there's a huge literature and discussion on that, but fundamentally they're understood to be particularizing forces. They are cognitions that divide the world up into different bits and pieces. And then how the individual relates with those different ideas of the world, how the body relates therefore to those different ideas of the world, inform and construct those experiences. And meditation is understood to be in varieties of different types, techniques of meditations in the plural, like sports in the plural, are understood to be ways in which to sort of probe, investigate, but also deconstruct and sort of really learn and understand how those fundamental dynamics work in order to be free from them. So anyways, I just want to sort of add a little bit from the Tibetan tradition as far as this, primarily this construct between Nyamjak and Jetok, or mediated and unmediated. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. We'll continue because it's a really important point. We'll just take